So I mentioned before we started tonight, we kind of have a rotation thing that we do here. First week of the month is focused on a scripture, and then second week is a dharma talk sermon. So last week what we read was something called the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, which the tradition says is the first lesson the Buddha ever delivered after his enlightenment, the discourse setting the wheel of dharma in motion. And if you guys remember from last week, one of the things, and you've probably run across this idea, one of the things that it talks about is kind of one of the core central aspects of Buddhism, which is something called usually in English it's called the Four Noble Truths, right? So a good simple way to think about this is it's a lot like the way a doctor works in terms of working with someone who has a disease. The first thing the doctor needs to do is to diagnose the disease, right? And then you try to figure out where the heck it came from in the first place, and then you kind of try to figure out what's the prognosis here, what's the chance of recovery, and then you kind of lay out a treatment plan, right? And prescription. That's kind of doctors tend to work. So if you think about the Four Noble Truths in that sense. So first of all, the great physician, the Buddha, the great physician, said the fundamental human disease is dukkha, and usually that's translated as suffering, right? So something more like dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction might be closer to what he really had in mind, but the basic idea. Bad things happen, good things don't last. That's kind of the core idea of what dukkha is referring to. So secondly, what's the cause of that? Where does that come from? And the Buddha in the Four Noble Truths says the cause of that dukkha is tanha, which means desire. Sometimes it's explained as craving and clinging, right? We crave desirable things that we don't have. We cling on to desirable things that we have, and we don't want to lose them, and we don't want them to change. And then there's the mirror image of both of those things. There's fearing and resisting undesirable things and that haven't happened yet, and kind of hating the undesirable things that have happened or that we do have. So that's what the first Noble Truth says. And the first and second Noble Truth say that. The disease is suffering, the cause is desire, craving and clinging. The fact that the Buddha Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha begin, you could say, with suffering is why it's sometimes been accused of being pessimistic, right? The Buddha is portrayed by some critics as kind of the ultimate Debbie Downer, right? Life sucks, then you die, and there's nothing you can do about it. It's kind of the sense that you get. Life is just suffering. Life is just suffering. One of the oldest examples of this kind of criticism is an image. It actually comes from China that's called the Vinegar Tasters. I first ran across this, not seeing it, but a description of it in a pretty famous book. Benjamin Hoff's The Tao of Pooh talks about this image. Again, it's of Chinese origin. There are lots of different versions of it. Nobody knows where it came from. Nobody knows how it got started. But what it shows is, and again, sometimes it's paintings, the sculptures, little ceramic figures. So here's what it shows. It's the founders of the three great religious traditions of China, right? So you've got the Buddha for Buddhism. You've got Confucius, right? The founder of Confucianism. And then you've got Lao Tzu, the ancient old man, the sage who's attributed as being the founder of the Taoist religious tradition. And if you imagine the three of them are standing around a big ceramic pot of the type that they used in East Asia to make sauces in and this sort of thing, and to brew vinegar in. So each of them's got a finger up because they just dipped their finger into the vinegar pot and they tasted it, right? And what you're supposed to focus on in this image is their faces, because they've all got a different look on their face, right? Confucius has this really sour look on his face because from a Confucian point of view, life is sour and people don't know how to act right. So society needs a lot of rules for the people to follow so that they'll behave themselves and live in proper relation to one another. And the Buddha has this kind of bitter expression on his face because life is bitter because it's full of suffering, right? That's that. But then Lao Tzu, again, this is kind of Taoist propaganda, this Vinegar Tasters image, because Lao Tzu has this happy look on his face. He has this sweet expression on his face because from a Taoist understanding, life is sweet when you live it in a completely natural way. Right? So it's definitely an image that's a little bit propaganda for Taoism. Now, in modern terms, if you think about that bitter expression on the Buddha's face in that painting and the accusation, what would we call that? We'd call that pessimism, right? That the Buddha is pessimistic by starting with suffering, with dukkha. Critics say the Buddha Dharma is ultimately pessimistic. Okay, but is it, right? Let's go a little deeper with that. So first of all, an objective consideration makes it clear. If you think about the First Noble Truth, it's kind of undeniably true what the First Noble Truth says. All composite things are subject to decay. Denying that kind of sets us up to be disappointed. In the end of everything is built into it from the beginning, right? Every object that people make, a cup, a car, a house, contains its own eventual brokenness from the start. The glass is kind of broken from the minute you make it because it's inevitable that it's going to be broken. Regardless of what fairy tales say, no relationship actually continues happily ever after, right? Obviously. Eventually all relationships end. In the long run, if Snow White and her prince don't get sick of each other and break up, one or the other of them is going to die. And that's going to be the end of the relationship. Every living thing, every tree, every flower, every insect, every bird, every dog, every person, they all eventually die. From our first breath to the last breath, death is kind of with us the whole time because that's the inevitable outcome of life is death. Similarly, if you think about the second noble truth, it's kind of undeniably correct psychology, right? Suffering and dissatisfaction don't happen because of that inherent brokenness and death that everything contains. They happen because people can't tolerate the brokenness and the death that they contain. It's our view of life that makes us miserable, not life itself. Dukkha is a consequence of mind, right? It's an unpleasant side effect of having a big brain that's capable of consciousness and therefore able to imagine alternative circumstances that would be preferable. Oh, I wish something else would have happened, right? And so we kind of set ourselves up for that dissatisfaction. If you go back to the image of the vinegar taster and that bitter expression on the Buddha's face in the painting, the vinegar is only bitter if you think there should be honey in the pot, right? The vinegar tastes just fine if you know it's vinegar, in which case it simply is what it is. It tastes how it tastes. There's nothing to be miserable about. Everything's as it should be. It's when we're ignorant about the contents of the jar, when we delude ourselves into believing that it's honey, when we believe in a self that deserves only sweetness, that's when the taste of the vinegar is bitter. Right? The vinegar is only bitter if you don't know it's vinegar, if you think it's honey instead. So really, the better comeback to the accusation that the Buddha Dharma is pessimistic is that the Buddha gave us those first two noble truths, but he didn't stop there, right? He gave us two more noble truths. It's the four noble truths, right? So maybe if he'd stopped with just the first two, then you could rightly say that the Buddha was a pessimist, as I said a minute ago. Life sucks, then you die, and there's nothing you do about it, right? That would be pretty pessimistic. But that's not what the Buddha said. He didn't stop at two truths, he gave us four. And if you think about the last two, they're actually really optimistic, right? If suffering is the disease, the third noble truth says that the disease not only is curable, but especially as we understand it in the Mahayana part of Buddhism, it's absolutely certain that the disease will be cured. It's sort of inevitable that the disease would be cured. Before the Buddha came along, in the ancient religion of India, the Vedic tradition of India, going back to the old Vedas, that was kind of the spiritual environment that the Buddha was growing up in. The belief was that people are born and die, and are reincarnated and die again, and are born and die again, and are born and die again, and so on in a never-ending cycle. Every life and death is filled with pain, and for some people there's more pain than others as a function of their unchangeable position in society. That's the idea of samsara, if you've heard that expression, samsara, the wheel of life, death, and rebirth, this wheel, right? That we're all this cyclical process. But then the Buddha came along and said, no, that's not how it is. That's not the way things actually work. That's not the inevitable way it has to be. That's not the true nature of things. Every rebirth is not another cycle of the same old pain over and over again. Every rebirth is another opportunity to wake up from our ignorance and break that wheel, to break that cycle. You can stop the merry-go-round. If you've ever been on a merry-go-round, they always have an emergency switch, right? A big red button. You can, if there's something goes wrong, you can push the big red button and that thing will stop. Right? So there's always a button there to turn it off. And the Buddha came along and said, the switch is right there, right? There's a button right there. You just have to push it. You just have to realize that it's there, and then you just have to flip that switch. The problem is that while the Buddha is pointing at the switch, we're too busy looking at his finger. It's like with a dog, you know about this, right? You're pointing at something, and the dog just looks at your finger, right? Because the dog doesn't understand the gesture, right? The gesture is saying the thing is over there, but the dog just focuses on the finger. Well, we do kind of the same thing, right? The Buddha is pointing at the switch. He's pointing at this is the way you turn off the wheel, and we're too busy looking at his finger to realize what the gesture is actually pointing at. Curing the disease from the Buddhist point of view is inevitable, if not in this life, then in a future life when we finally open our eyes and look and say, oh, the switch was there the whole freaking time. I could have pushed it at any point. I just wasn't paying enough, I wasn't looking in the right place. I wasn't paying enough attention. So that's the third noble truth. And if you think about the fourth noble truth is completely optimistic because it lays out the treatment plan, right? The fourth noble truth is the Eightfold Path, right? The prescription, the great prescription, the great physician wrote for us, right? So we've got right understanding, samaditi, right thought, samasankappa, right speech, samavacha, right action, samakamanta, right livelihood, samaajiva, right effort, samavayama, right mindfulness, samasati, right concentration, samasamadhi. We can make that a lot simpler. We can slim that whole thing down there because those things kind of cluster together. There's really three things there, right? There's shila, morality, right? Speech, right action, right livelihood. Those are all about morality, living a moral life. Samadhi, mental discipline, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. Those all have to do with what do we do with our minds. And then prajna, wisdom, right understanding and right thought. How do we understand the world? How do we understand our lives? How do we understand our function? So that word, if you listen as I read all those in Sanskrit, sama, like sama samadhi, sama, that's the word that usually gets translated as right, which is why they all say right, like right understanding, right thought. But that's a little bit problematic. Using the word right's a little bit problematic. Not that there's anything wrong with the word right, but when people hear the word right, they naturally tend to oppose the word right with wrong, right? Like the opposite of right is wrong. So, the opposite of the right path would be the wrong path. And that's not really quite right. It might be more helpful rather than saying right to say fruitful or productive, right? Because the opposite of any of these things would be unfruitful and unproductive. It doesn't lead to good things, right? So it's not right in the sense of being the opposite of wrong. It's more right in terms of going in the right way, doing something that's actually going to be productive. And calling these things a path, right? It's the Eightfold Path. Path is an analogy. That really shows the optimism, right? It's fundamentally optimistic. The Buddha says, live this way, train your mind in this way, and you'll be on the path that leads toward truth, toward enlightenment. It's like, when you ask somebody for directions and they tell you, just keep going, just go that way. And you can't miss it. It's right there. You can't miss it, right? Just go that way. And that's kind of what the Buddha is doing. You're guaranteed to get to your destination if you just keep going that way. Just follow the path that they lay out for you. So if we put the Four Noble Truths together, if you think of the first two as being pessimistic, the last two are clearly really optimistic. So the whole formula is kind of realistic, right? The pessimism, the optimism kind of balance each other out, and we end up with something that's just kind of makes sense. It just kind of is realistic. There's a problem, but there's also a solution, right? Life is fundamentally flawed, but there is something you can do about it, right? And so in the balance of those opposites, here's another example of a term that's often used to talk about what the Buddha taught, the idea of the middle way, right? You can think about the middle way as being between, on the one hand, not hedonistic pleasure seeking, but on the other hand, not a sort of ascetic self-mortification. But we can think about a middle way here too, right? It's a moderation in between, not pessimism, not optimism, but realism in between. So since we're talking about optimism and pessimism, you just think about the old joke, right? The optimist says the glass is half full. Right? The pessimist says the glass is half empty. The engineer says the glass is twice as big as it needs to be. The Buddha says, shut up and drink the water. That's the only thing that actually matters. Sambhava Shipshio, may you, I, and all beings manifest enlightenment.